Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about the future and how we can envision and design for accessibility. And for those of you who have been at previous sessions in the Accessibility Network, we will definitely be taking a different approach today where it'll be a bit more hands-on, where I want you to actually move through a bit of a design thinking process to create and think about the accessible classroom and the accessible future for your students. So we'll be doing that. And if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. I'll be checking the chat. You can also unmute. We have a relatively small group today. A little bit about me. I am an ed tech project specialist at SDCOE, the San Diego County Office of Education. Before starting at the county office, I taught third grade and also middle school English. And I also served at my school as an educational technology and curriculum coordinator. And I have an assistive technology certification. And this is where I really like to bring what I've learned about assistive technology into thinking about our students and the classroom and how we can adjust our pedagogy and our thinking to support them with assistive technology. On the slides that I shared today, and I'll share them one more time, we have the slides that have my contact email and also a link to the slides. So if you want to access later, that's the link. And I always like to leave up this disclaimer, and this session won't apply as much, but what we share today and think about is not legal advice. And if we share any resources or tools, we recommend that you make sure that you are following your district's policy for vetting resources for privacy and reliability, and also know that there are so many resources and tools out there. There are many to explore. We're just presenting some. And if a student has a specific disability, it's always best to support them by going through their specialists for 504s and IEPs, as well as talking to their family before implementing any tools and strategies. Okay. So in the session today, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to talk about how to engage in design thinking. Some of you may be familiar with the process. It's been out for a while now. It's similar to the engineering design process. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to use design thinking and how to inclusively design for our learners. We will also look at some examples of assistive technology and how they were originally designed for individuals who had different disabilities, but now they are mainstream and many people are using them in multiple different ways. And then we will walk through our own mini design thinking process. Nothing stressful, just a little bit of envisioning. So before we get started with that, I want to share this video that I think really sums up the idea of accessibility and inclusion. So you should be able to hear my sound, but let me know if you have any trouble.
Today, we're facing a huge challenge because we really didn't design this world to serve for everyone.
One of our greatest barriers to making progress when it comes to being more inclusive is that we have a tendency to design and engineer things for ourselves.
90% of companies prioritize diversity, 4% consider disability.
So 1.3 billion population we're talking about. It's a market that is not being tapped into. With the fourth industrial revolution, our aim should be to attain inclusive growth, which really benefits everyone.
These individuals and voices need to be intrinsic to the development of projects, legislation, from the very moment of the conception of the idea. Otherwise, we're still creating within the framework and lenses and biases that exist within the society.
If just under 20% of our global market has a disability, how can you serve that market if you don't understand it internally in your business?
As technology changes, we will need to think about how it can, in fact, augment human capability of different abilities, give them the skills so that they can fully participate in our economies.
Así como existen múltiples diversidades de universo, también existen diversidades en capacidades, generando potencialidades que pueden ser aprovechadas en beneficio no solo de las personas con discapacidad, sino de toda la sociedad.
some of the car manufacturers have started introducing these exoskeletons into their production line. On the one hand, you could think of these as helping to protect people who have normal physical abilities, or you could imagine that these same exoskeletons could help people who before would not have been able to do the job, but now they can.
The best is to think about these as not assistive technologies, but really come at the product and service with universal design principles.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
你们是在家还是在学校? You are at home or at school.
We are all at school right now.
There's not one product or service that fits everyone, but there is one mindset that everybody benefits from is a full human experience.
Making sure that we think inclusively whenever we build something, because somebody who doesn't have any disability today is not guaranteed that he won't have a disability tomorrow.
Maybe we can move to the point of thinking beyond this idea of differently abled meaning less than something, but that we're all differently abled.
The greatest force for change is going to be the importance of individuals being willing to step forward and be vulnerable, sharing their unique lived experience, which is going to shape business frameworks and political legislation with empathy rooted at every decision.
The next generation voice is the greatest chance that we have for change, for an inclusion revolution that means everyone, and no one is left behind.
And I want to touch on one thing that was said about the idea that differently abled or somebody who has what we consider to be a disability doesn't necessarily, actually, it never means less than. It just means different from. And there's a lot of research out there about the idea of social versus medical looks at disabilities, and the idea that the medical profession looks at disabilities as something less than. Whereas when you look at disabilities as a social construct, it just means that we need to think about what we perceive as normal differently and adjust accordingly. And so many times when we start to do that, we actually benefit everyone. And so that's really what they're saying here. But does anybody else have anything that they want to add that they got from this video, or just thinking about the idea of including everyone, maybe the idea of how we look at disability as a negative sometimes, but we can really think of it as just different. I'll pause for just a minute in case anyone wants to unmute or share in the chat. All right. Well, if you do decide that you want to chime in, feel free to unmute or type into the chat. So we're going to move forward with the idea of designing for accessibility and equity. And one of the keys for this is focusing on empathy. And a lot of people have probably been hearing a lot about empathy-based design or empathy-based thinking in the classroom, social emotional learning. All of these things kind of go together, and it means leading with understanding other people. And as you understand other people, you can start to design for them, and you can start to support them in the ways that they need it, rather than kind of guessing at it or feeling sorry for people. And that, I think, goes right back to that medical versus social model, where there's no need to necessarily feel sorry for people. It's really about empathizing with them, understanding, and then creating things that can make it so that they're able to do all of the same things as we're able to do and more. So to do that, you use empathy and design thinking, and you create using curb cutting principles. And for many people, you may be familiar with the curb cuts that you see at the edges of streets. And this is part of a universal design universal design approach that was introduced by Ronald Mace in the 1980s. He was a disabled individual, and he created this idea that buildings should be universally designed for people so that all people could access them. So it didn't limit people who had different abilities. And so while he didn't create the individual curb cut, he created the principles of universal design. And curb cuts are a perfect example of that, because they were actually developed individuals with disabilities and supporters of individuals with disabilities in up in Northern California went through in the middle of the night and began to create these curb cut ramps. And the reason that they did this was so that individuals with wheelchairs could navigate through the cities. And after doing this, it actually changed legislation and made things that were more accessible. It kind of started opening a window. But in addition to that, it also made it so that curb cuts are now a norm. That wasn't the case before, but now it is. And when you think about curb cuts, they definitely help individuals with disabilities who are in a wheelchair, but they're used by so many other people. And in the chat, I was wondering if you could tell me just a few examples of other people who use those ramps in the streets or when you're getting out of buildings using the ramps. When else could that be beneficial? Delivery workers, yeah. Bikes,
People in scooters.
Scooters, absolutely. Yep, people who are pushing strollers, grocery carts, absolutely. So there are so many uses for that, and that's that perfect example, luggage. That's that perfect example of the curb cutting effect, and very much so that's the universal design, which then was transferred to universal design for learning, which we talked a little bit about in previous sessions. And really that's where you start thinking about how you design your classroom and your curriculum to meet the needs of all learners. Okay, so design thinking is an empathy-based, human-centered approach to designing solutions. And so this is the design thinking phase or process right here. So you start with empathy. You understand who the person that you are creating a solution for is and what they need. You define what they're looking for. So, what are they struggling with? What do they want to see changed? And then you ideate, you come up with tons and tons of ideas for solutions that could be feasible, but it could also be really out in left field. It could be expensive. It could be, something that will probably never happen, but you dream big. And then you narrow those down and you prototype, which is usually the building phase where you just make a quick model of your thing that you want to build to see if it works. And then you test it. So you make this model and then you see, does this actually work? If I'm creating a curb cut, does it help somebody with a wheelchair to actually move down, or do I need to adjust it? Is it too steep? Is it whatever it is? You test it and then you just keep going back and forth until you are able to get the product that helps the most people. And what's really great about design thinking is it shifts the power relationship between people who hold the power to design and people who are impacted by design, because there are so many examples where people are designing and they're designing for people. And one of the mottos with disabilities and individuals with disabilities is nothing for us without us. So the idea that it's really important to include whomever you're designing for as you design, because without their voice, you can be designing things that you think are beneficial, and it's taking that sympathy lens. It's taking the jumping to conclusions based on what you know and you think is the norm, but not actually meeting the needs of the people you're designing for. And inclusive design I put in here is really considering human diversity and the ability to solve for one group and then extend to many. And so as you tailor things to one group, a lot of times it ends up supporting all. Any questions or anyone want to chime in with anything before we move into some examples of inclusive design? All right. So here are some examples of universally designed products. And I always like to share this because a lot of times when we are using things frequently, we don't know the history behind them and that they were actually designed for a completely different purpose or for a specific group of people. And so for those of you who maybe use the OXO brand or those that kitchen utensils that have the really big handles that I find to be so much easier in the kitchen, those were originally designed to support somebody who had mobility issues in their hands. And so the person who created these created the bigger handle so that the person would be able to much more easily grip and hold on to things as they were maneuvering in the kitchen. Additionally, in the kitchen and also just some other things. We talked about curb cuts, but in the kitchen shelves that are pull down and also double drawer dishwashers were made for people with wheelchairs. But a lot of times as people are designing their kitchens, they opt to use those because really they are more kind of flexible and easy to maneuver. And then this one's kind of fun. A lot of people don't know this, but the Segways that we are currently using all the time, some of those scooters and Segways, were actually the technology of an iBot wheelchair with the balancing technology, but they were too expensive to be utilized in the wheelchair, and so they were turned into Segway devices. And then for those of us who use things on our phone or a computer like text to speech and speech to text, those were initially created for individuals who either could not speak, they had a hard time talking, or they had a hard time hearing, different things that they were designed for disabilities, but now we use them all the time. Maybe if we're cooking dinner and we want to be able to type out a message to someone, we say, "Hey Siri," and we have it type for us. So again, all these things that are really frequent in our everyday products. Also door openers. So anytime you have a door that's opening automatically, originally that was designed for people in wheelchairs. Many people don't know, but electric toothbrushes were originally designed for individuals who had limited motor skills, but we all know that they clean our teeth so much better and are so much easier to use. So that's another one that was turned into an everyday product. Books on tape, those of us who listen to audiobooks or books on tape when we are driving or at the gym, those were originally created for individuals who are blind. And the eye gaze software that is used in cars, or sorry, the software that's used in cars for safety and looking at location and also tracking where users look on websites. So a lot of that information where it tracks what you're looking at so that it can then give you tailored ads. All of that was originally from eye gaze software that was meant for people with disabilities. So lots and lots of examples. Can anybody think of any other examples? There are so many out there. Okay. So let's move on to accessible physical learning environments. And I wanted to include this in this envisioning an accessible future because I really wanted you to not only start thinking about products, which can be really helpful to students, especially if you have a school or a room in your school where you have 3D printing. Actually, it's been really exciting for us at my building in the Linda Vista Innovation Center because we take students through the same design thinking process that you'll be doing today. And students are designing now for their peers that have disabilities. So they go through the whole design thinking process and then they're 3D printing solutions for students. So that's absolutely one option, is creating and thinking about products that can help your students. And they don't have to be new. I like to think that innovation isn't creating something new all the time. It's making something that already exists also just better for usability or better for accessibility or whatever it is. And so maybe it's just as simple as creating a lever that helps somebody to hold something, but creating those physical objects and products. But accessibility can also be accessible curriculum like UDL, and it can be accessible physical learning environments. So I wanted to put that in here too, because designing our classrooms can be really helpful when we are thinking about our students and accessibility. So some of the things that are really important when you are thinking about physical locations and the accessibility is always making sure that your directions, your instructions, and any procedures that you have. And in the classroom, we have so many things that we go through, routines that we do often. Those types of things are in large print so that individuals who are visually impaired, but also individuals who have a hard time focusing can see the words. Additionally, symbols, so that for individuals who struggle with reading and cognition, they have symbols, and then words so that people can use things like text readers where they scan and then it can be read aloud to them, all used to label your classroom. So that can be really helpful. And make sure that when you are labeling things, it's viewable from multiple angles. Additionally, keeping in mind if you have certain emergency procedures, and I know as a classroom teacher, when I was in the classroom, you have all of these routines and procedures for emergencies, but if you do have students in your class who have a specific disability, taking that into account and adjusting what might need to happen for specific students. Do things need to change for students to feel safe in your classroom? And then always, if you can, offering spoken and printed directions. Anytime you can provide multiple ways that a student can access the information, it's really helpful. I put in here also in the slides a universal design of physical spaces checklist. It's a long research, so I didn't want to go over it today. But if you want to go back, you can check. It's pretty comprehensive and it'll give you suggestions on designing physical spaces, not just classrooms, but just physical spaces in general. And then when you are designing your learning space, think about whether it is accessible for a range of physical abilities, and does the room provide space for inclusion for wheelchairs, students who maybe have an interpreter or an assistant? So you need to make sure that there's enough space, it's not too cluttered, so that individuals can have who they need or what they need accessible to them. Applying universal design principles, making flexible workstations. So I know a lot of us are now thinking more about how they can have flex seating in their classroom, and this can be really helpful for individuals with disabilities. And decorating learning spaces with purpose. So instead of having those cluttered walls that have so much on them just to be decorative, thinking about what we're providing on the walls, whether it's overwhelming for students, does it actually provide something where they can then look at that information and move forward toward their learning with that information. And I linked on here, and we'll talk about this right now, this website for designing classrooms. I'm going to share it in the chat as well. It is a really awesome website. And it basically, you go in, you create an account, and then it allows you to create a floor plan. And so today, when we get into the designing phase, if this is the way that you choose to design, go through your design process and think about your classroom, you can use this tool. So you can go in and create a new room. And you all know your classroom, so you can kind of keep it as limited to your classroom as it is. So if you only have specific things, you can represent them with specific desks or tables and chairs, and you can start adding elements to your classroom, thinking about what would be useful for your students. And so, for example, maybe if you have a student who has a wheelchair, in addition to having their normal table and chairs, you might want to also add a shelf for them so that they can then place something on the shelf. Or if you have a blind student and they have a cane, maybe you have a shelf there so that they can clasp the cane onto the shelf. And so thinking through, and then you can pull it over and design your classroom piece by piece. Once you have thought about designing the classroom, it's also important to think about how you're going to use your classroom. And so some important things that I like to think about in the classroom are temperature. So depending on what students you have, students have different ideal temperatures, and that can make it difficult to tailor it to students, but making sure that your room isn't too hot or too cold where it makes somebody uncomfortable, because that prevents quality learning. Adjusting the lighting. Lighting plays a huge role, and that includes things like glare. And so certain colors have different glares than other colors, and you can really you can look at, there are tools and websites where you can actually look at like what has different glares, but you can also just if you close your eye and kind of squint, you can see whether the glare is a lot. And then noise levels. So some of our learners do really well with quiet classrooms. So sometimes there are some tools that moderate the noise level in your class. Always recommend considering using one of those, something like a bouncy balls, which represents visually how loud your classroom is. Another thing that can be really interesting, and I know that a lot of our schools use these already, but sensory paths. So if students can use some kind of pathway in the classroom that actually helps to intrigue their senses, so maybe there's some tactile elements within a pathway or a hallway, that can be really beneficial for learners. And then we already talked about materials at different heights and items that can be used with either hand. We already have users who are left-handed or right-handed, but we also have users who maybe have limited mobility in some of their hands. And then providing opportunities for small group and quiet work when possible. I know that's hard in some classrooms, but if there is an area where students can have that quiet time if they need it, that's always really useful too. So before we get into the design process, does anyone have any questions or anything to add? Great, thank you, Jennifer. And I'm gonna put in the chat bouncy balls. That was the one for noise that might be useful for monitoring the noise in your classroom. And there are lots of others. You just kind of look at like a noise meter tool and you can find lots. The same, if you look for Chrome extensions for like looking at color glare. I love the sensory path. I see this in, yep. Yeah, so I really think that it can be an incredibly good way to incorporate inclusivity into your class, just building out like a sensory path or some kind of flow in your classroom that includes tactile elements to stimulate your kinesthetic learners, your learners who learn well through tactile and sensory. Okay, so it is your turn. And with that, we are going to move through, like I said, a mini design process. We're going to, and you have lots of options. You can think about if you want to design a product that you will create for a specific student, or do you want to design your classroom? Do you want to design a curriculum unit? It's kind of flexible time for you. And so I know sometimes people like to get the information and they don't want to participate, but it is a powerful activity if you do feel like designing something today, lots of options. And so the first stage in the design process is empathy. So normally when you are doing design thinking, you would conduct interviews. So you would interview your specific student or all of your students to see what they need, what's a challenge for them, what they're finding to be those pain points within the classroom. And that helps you to listen and then understand people's situations. Today, we're not going to actually interview anyone. But I'm going to leave up this chart and I'm going to turn off my camera and mute myself for 5 minutes. And I just want you to start thinking about either one student in your classroom or your whole class, maybe a group of students. Who are they? What do they have difficulty with? And then what can you design or what would they like to see designed to help them do what they want to do? So that could be, again, changing the way you configure your classroom. It could be changing the way you present your curriculum, or it could be a product or a tool. So I'm going to, like I said, give you 5 minutes and just feel free. If you have paper, you can jot it down. If you're on the computer, which you all are, you can just take notes or you can just think about it. It's just really a time for you to kind of move through these 3 boxes for either a single person or your whole class. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute. I am still on. I don't like to intimidate people by staring at them while they're thinking, so. And I will start us back up at 5:06. So that's the timer we use with students sometimes and definitely reminds you to come back with us. Does anyone, now that we are done with our 5 minutes, want to share just what they're thinking about through the empathy phase before we move into the define phase? And this is the longest phase. When we do activities within our labs, we tend to do the empathizing portion for a longer period than the define or the ideate portion because it's so important. This is kind of that crux of figuring out who the person you're designing for is. So I made sure to give you a little bit more time for it. So I'll give just a minute if anyone does want to unmute or share in the chat. And if I don't hear from anyone, we'll move into stage 2. Okay. So in stage 2, which is the define stage of the design thinking process, for especially when we're talking with kids about this, what we do is when you've done an interview with someone and you've recorded information about what they need and what they'd like, you then go through and you underline the verbs and the activities to help you start to define what they want and how you can make that happen. For us adults, this will really just be kind of taking what we've learned from listening and compiling it into a problem statement once we've analyzed what has been said. So depending on whether you want to take the more nuanced approach of underlining and then looking back at it, or you want to just look through it and form a problem statement, either way, you are defining the problem. And this is just a sample of the defined statement, and it can really vary. But I put in here, my student or students maybe struggle with blank and needs a solution that will blank. So depending if you're doing it for one student, my student struggles with, and I put, my students struggle with math without using manipulatives and need a solution that will allow them to access the content kinesthetically. Now, as I'm starting to move into the next phase, this is where I would start to think about, okay, if they need to access things kinesthetically, what are my ideas? What are my options? And so we'll continue with this need statement when I give you the example. But really, for the next 2 minutes, you're just going to take what you figured out during the empathy phase, and you are going to complete a problem statement or a need statement that is similar to this. You can use my template or you can create your own, and I will turn off my camera and unmute. And we'll be back at 5:11. Okay, so that was our define stage. Does anyone have any questions about the define stage or want to share what they defined? So if our define stage, we came up with our students struggle with math without manipulatives, and we are going to give them kinesthetic options. During our ideate stage, we would come up with many ideas to solve the problem. And then normally during ideation, you would sketch. During today's, we're going to do something a little bit differently. And then you would get some feedback from your group that you're working with. And so in the ideation stage, normally we do a couple of things that we're not going to do today. But when you start to solve the problem and you come up with ideas, a lot of times what it is just post-it notes on the wall, thinking about if I had infinite money, what would I do? Would I have drones that drop manipulatives to my students and each one of them can get whatever drone they need? Would I have a robot that explains things to them and like actually moves? Would I have just endless amounts of opportunities for kinesthetic manipulatives? Would I 3D print some things? Would I take some materials that I already have, like a glass jar full of pennies, and give those to students so that it can help them count? And so you really start thinking about as many things as you can, and then you think about what is the best solution that you can actually make, and that's going to be your first prototype. And so for me, because I have a 3D printer, I'm going to think about what my units are, and I'm going to say, okay, I am teaching fractions, so I'm going to create a manipulative of fraction strips. So I'm going to have a whole, I'm going to have a half and a half, and I'm going to create that for my students so that I don't have to go out and buy things. I can just have them. I can have them in multiple colors so kids can see different colors of the different fraction values, and I can reasonably do that. If you don't have a 3D printer, what could you do instead? You can create paper fraction strips for students to use. And so starting to think about what you can do in your classroom. So 2 minutes of just first outrageous ideations, and then what can you actually do? And we'll be back at 5:16. All right, so you had your outrageous ideas. Does anyone want to share any outrageous ideas or their final idea of what they could feasibly do? And once you've created your final idea of what you think would actually work, your next stage is going to be to prototype. And that's where you can take things that already exist and adjust them. You can create completely new ideas. You think about how it fits in real life and you build it out enough so that you can test it. So normally a prototype, if it's like a computer program, they'll do it with a hyperlinked PowerPoint, or they'll make a mock-up in Google Slides or in a software that the company uses. If it is a physical product, they will create things out of cardboard, or they'll create it out of found materials that are easy to use. You can put it together really quickly. It's called rapid prototyping. And that way, if there are things that need to be changed, you just scrap the whole thing or you adjust one part and you didn't waste a whole lot of time. And so that builds the efficiency to keep changing until it's good. In our case today, because we aren't going to be building anything, we are instead going to take the 5 minutes and we are going to sketch our solution. But what I'm going to ask for you to do during this 5 minutes is you can sketch it on paper. And I would love, if you do sketch it on paper, for you to add it as a file to our chat, if you feel comfortable. But the other thing I want to share with you, which is a really good tool for just the quick sketch, and you can share it with your students. I really like to use this to just get kids thinking about what they're going to be designing, is this program called AutoDraw. And Google Draw works as well. So for people who are on Google Schools, that works too. But with AutoDraw, you can do all the same types of things you can do by with Google Drawings, like adding shapes, adding fill, text, whatever it is. But there's also this feature of the magic pen. And what I like about the magic pen is as you start to draw things, it uses AI to recognize what it thinks you're trying to draw. And so I was trying to draw a wave, not that easy using a mouse. Now it recognizes it and it can fix it for me. And so I do that. And then if I want to change my color, okay, now I want to change it. So I have my sun. And again, sometimes it's really hard to draw on the computer. So if you'd rather draw physically, you absolutely can. But once you've started to do this, you can build out your picture quickly using AutoDraw. And if you feel comfortable doing that, take a screenshot of that at the end of the 5 minutes and share it with us in the chat. That would be great too. So you don't have to share, but we would love to see what you're thinking about and just kind of end this on, seeing a little bit about it. So I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes. You can use AutoDraw or just draw something out, spend about 5 minutes sketching your solution, and then we'll come back and conclude our session. So we'll be back at 5:25. And I guess I also should have mentioned if you are designing your classroom using the floor planner, feel free to take a screenshot of that too and share that in the chat as well. So whatever option you're going for, feel free to share. All right, so hopefully you had time to either design your classroom or to draw a solution. And if anyone has anything that they want to share, feel free to add it as a file in the chat. You can also, if you want to, let me know and I can help you share, or I can have you share your screen or something like that. You can undo your camera and put it up if it's a one that you did manually rather than on the computer. So lots of options. And while we're doing that, I'm also just going to move to our final two slides. So if anyone has anything that they want to share today that they took away from this, just something that they're excited about, or any questions that they have about design thinking or thinking about inclusivity, and what are your next steps? So just kind of an open opportunity for you to share any questions, thoughts, things that you're excited about. And our next session is coming on May 30th. It's a little bit different. It is a collaboration between two of our networks, our equity network and our accessibility network. So Pamela Rabin and I will be presenting on accessibility and inclusive technology on a Thursday instead of a Tuesday from 5 to 6 on May 30th. Great, Jennifer. Glad that you liked auto draw and you'll be able to share it. Since we are talking about AI and things you're sharing with your AI committee, I will share one other resource in the chat that our EdTech team created. It is just a tool of productivity tools for teachers that are AI that you might find useful. So I'll add that to the chat right now, just kind of a bonus in case you'd like. So let me grab that for you, and don't mind that you will see my screen for a second as I pull it up so I can grab it. So this tool, and you're all welcome to use it. We just went through and we thought about things not necessarily related to accessibility. This was for our productivity and AI training that we did. That's also recorded and on our website. But we went through and we thought about things that teachers generally do, like creating quizzes, letters of rec, IEP goals, report card comments, and we tested some of the tools that were out. We did this in December, I believe, so there have been definite changes since we've done it, but it gives you the link to the tool, how we thought they did on some common teacher things, their pricing, and then a blurb about what they do. So it might be useful to you, just an extra AI add-on for those of you who managed to make it through the design process. Excellent. Thank you, Teresa. And I think I'll stop sharing, but we hope to see you on May 30th from 5 to 6, and I can stay on for a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions. Thank you. Good night.